Thomas Wilson never expected to inherit his late uncle's modest suburban home. At 35, he had been renting apartments his entire adult life, so receiving the keys to the small three-bedroom house with a decent backyard felt like winning the lottery. The property wasn't perfect. The above-ground pool that dominated the backyard was showing its age with faded blue siding and questionable structural integrity. Still, Thomas was grateful. As he toured his new home, he noticed the fence between his property and the neighbor's yard was practically non-existent, just a few rotting posts marking where a proper division should have been. The executor of his Uncle Frank's estate, a tired-looking lawyer named Mr. Grayson, had handed over the keys with a stack of papers and a brief, awkward pat on the shoulder. "Frank always spoke highly of you," he said. "Said you were the only one who visited without wanting something." Thomas had felt a pang of guilt at that. He hadn't visited his uncle nearly enough in those final months. Standing in the living room that first evening, surrounded by his uncle's possessions, the worn leather recliner where Frank had taught him to play chess, the crowded bookshelves filled with dog-eared mystery novels, the faded photographs of fishing trips from decades past, Thomas felt like an intruder. But there was also a strange sense of coming home, of picking up a thread his uncle had left specifically for him. The next morning, Thomas ventured into the backyard with a mug of coffee. May sunshine filtered through the oak trees, casting dappled light across the patchy lawn. The pool dominated everything, a 15-foot diameter above-ground behemoth that had clearly seen better days. Its once bright blue siding had faded to a weathered periwinkle and rust crept along the metal supports. Thomas circled it cautiously, noting the outdated pump system and the cracked plastic steps. He remembered swimming in it as a teenager during his summer visits, but that had to be at least 15 years ago. Beyond the pool, the yard sloped gently toward the neighboring property. Thomas frowned as he noticed the complete lack of a proper boundary. Only a few wooden posts remained of what must have once been a fence with large gaps between them that rendered any sense of division meaningless. Through these gaps, you could clearly see the neighbor's meticulously maintained garden, complete with stone pathways and carefully pruned rose bushes. The contrast with his uncle's overgrown yard was striking. As Thomas sipped his coffee, he noticed small toys scattered around the pool area, a faded plastic bucket, a deflated water wing, a collection of pool noodles in varying states of deterioration. He didn't remember his uncle mentioning any young visitors. Perhaps they belonged to the neighbor's children. It seemed odd that they would leave their toys in someone else's yard. That afternoon, Thomas found a folder labeled Home Maintenance in his uncle's desk. Inside were receipts, warranties, and instruction manuals for various household appliances. Near the bottom was a water testing kit for the pool and a faded receipt from Sunshine Pools and Spas dated 7 years ago. The final note in his uncle's shaky handwriting read, "Pool filter broken again. Too expensive to fix. Maybe time to remove the whole thing." Thomas ran his finger over the words, feeling as though his uncle had left him a message from beyond, confirming his own initial impression that the pool had become more burden than benefit. On his third day in the new house, Thomas was organizing the garage when a middle-aged woman with highlighted blonde hair styled in an angled bob approached him. She wore designer sunglasses pushed up on her head and a pastel cardigan despite the warm weather. Her arms were crossed as she stood at the edge of the driveway, watching him sort through boxes of his uncle's tools for several minutes before clearing her throat. "You must be Frank's nephew," she said, her voice carrying across the yard with practiced projection. "I've been wondering when someone would finally show up." Thomas set down the wrench he'd been examining and wiped his hands on his jeans before approaching. "Yes, I'm Thomas Wilson. Just moved in a few days ago." "Patricia Dunning," she replied, extending a manicured hand with several glittering rings. "I've lived next door for 15 years. Your uncle and I were very close." Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she gave his hand a quick, firm shake. Thomas noticed how she surveyed the property with a proprietary gaze, lingering particularly on the backyard. "Such a shame about Frank," Patricia continued, releasing his hand. "You really let things go toward the end. I told him he needed more help, but he was stubborn. Thankfully, I was here to step in when needed." Thomas nodded, unsure how to respond. His uncle had never mentioned any neighbors by name in their conversations. "I practically maintained the pool for him these last few summers," Patricia said, her voice taking on a hint of pride. "My husband's quite handy with that old filter system. We've kept it running when Frank couldn't be bothered." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That was kind of you." "Well, it benefited everyone," she said with a dismissive wave. "The neighborhood children use it all summer. My grandkids especially love swimming there. Jared, that's my son. He brings them over every other weekend. They've been looking forward to Lake Patricia all winter." She laughed at her own joke a little too loudly. "Lake Patricia?" Thomas repeated. "Oh, just a little nickname the kids came up with," she said, brushing invisible lint from her sleeve. "Since I'm the one who makes sure it's clean and ready for them." Thomas nodded again, a familiar knot of discomfort forming in his stomach, the same feeling he got when dealing with entitled customers at the hardware store where he worked. He noticed how Patricia repeatedly used our pool as she launched into a detailed account of the summer schedule she apparently established. We usually open the pool Memorial Day weekend, she explained, gesturing toward the backyard as if presenting a shared community space. My husband adds the chemicals, I sweep it out, and by June it's perfect. The Hendersons from across the street bring popsicles on Thursdays, and the Millers handle weekend cleanup. It's quite the little system we've worked out. As she spoke, Thomas noticed other neighbors peering curiously from their yards. An older man working in his garden 2 houses down caught Thomas's eye and gave a small, knowing shake of his head. Anyway, Patricia concluded with a sharp clap of her hands, my grandchildren will be visiting next weekend, and they're absolutely counting on their summer swim tradition. They've been talking about it for months. I told them, don't worry, the pool will be ready, so I trust we can count on you to have it cleaned up by then. Her question carried the unmistakable weight of an expectation, rather than a request. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but Patricia was already turning to leave. Welcome to the neighborhood, Tom. Stop by any time if you need pool maintenance tips. I've got it down to a science after all these years. As she walked away, her sandals clicking purposefully on the pavement, Thomas stood in his driveway with a growing realization that his inheritance might include more complications than he'd anticipated. After Patricia left, Thomas found himself inspecting the property line more carefully. The lack of a proper fence had clearly blurred boundaries, both literal and figurative. He walked the perimeter of his yard, using the property survey included in his inheritance paperwork as a guide. According to the official documents, the pool sat a full 7 feet within his property line. There was no ambiguity about ownership. That evening, Thomas sat at his kitchen table, spreading out the deed, property tax records, and homeowner's insurance policy. The paperwork confirmed what he already knew. The pool was entirely his responsibility and his liability. The insurance document specifically highlighted the pool as a high-risk feature that increases premium by nearly $600 annually. Thomas ran his fingers through his hair, sighing at the realization that his uncle's gift came with significant ongoing costs he hadn't anticipated. The next morning, Thomas decided to meet some other neighbors, hoping to gain perspective on the situation. He started with the elderly man he'd noticed watching his interaction with Patricia. Morning, Thomas called, walking over to where the man was pruning rose bushes. I'm Thomas Wilson, Frank's nephew. Just moved in. Harold Jenkins, the man replied, setting down his shears to shake Thomas' hand. Sorry about your uncle. Good man. Thanks, Thomas said. I was wondering if I could ask you about the neighborhood, specifically about the pool in my backyard. Harold's weathered face crinkled into a knowing smile. Ah, Lake Patricia, you mean? So you've heard that name too. Hard not to, Harold chuckled. Patricia's made sure everyone knows how generous she is with her pool. Started about 3 years ago when your uncle got too sick to maintain it properly. Over the next hour, Harold painted a clear picture. Frank had initially allowed Patricia's grandchildren to use the pool occasionally, but as his health declined, Patricia had gradually taken over, establishing an unofficial schedule and rules, inviting other families, and essentially claiming the pool as a neighborhood amenity that she managed. Your uncle was too kind-hearted to say anything, Harold explained, and too proud to admit he couldn't keep up with it anymore. Patricia took advantage of that. Thomas thanked Harold and continued his informal neighborhood survey. The Millers across the street confirmed they'd been part of the pool rotation but seemed embarrassed about it now. We always felt a bit uncomfortable, Mrs. Miller admitted. But Patricia insisted it was what Frank wanted, and we never heard otherwise from him. The Hendersons 2 doors down were more direct. That woman has been acting like she owns half the neighborhood for years, Mr. Henderson said bluntly. Your uncle was too nice to put her in her place, but some of us have been waiting for someone to finally do it. By Sunday afternoon, Thomas had spoken with 5 different neighbors, all of who shared variations of the same story. Patricia had gradually appropriated the pool, leveraging his uncle's illness to establish herself as the de facto manager of a community resource that was in reality private property with significant liability issues. Back at home, Thomas called his friend Miguel, who worked in property law. After explaining the situation, Miguel's advice was unequivocal. You have zero obligation to maintain a pool for neighborhood use, he said firmly. In fact, it's a liability nightmare. If someone got hurt using that pool without proper supervision or permission, you could be sued for everything you've got. My professional advice? Either secure it properly with locks, signs, and a real fence, or get rid of it entirely. Thomas thanked him and hung up, his mind made up. The pool was a financial burden, a safety risk, and apparently the source of neighborhood tension. Looking out the kitchen window at the faded blue monstrosity, Thomas made his decision. It was time for Lake Patricia to be drained for good. After getting quotes to repair the aging pool, nearly $3,000 for basic maintenance, and much more for bringing it up to code, Thomas made a practical decision. He didn't spend much, didn't want the liability, and certainly didn't want to bear the maintenance costs for a pool that Patricia seemed to think was communal property. He hired a contractor to remove the pool, planning to create a garden and patio space instead. The contractor was scheduled to begin work on Monday morning, and Thomas, wanting to be a good neighbor despite his concerns, walked over to Patricia's house on Sunday afternoon to inform her of his plans. The decision hadn't been made lightly. Thomas had spent hours researching his options, calling 3 different pool companies for assessments. Each contractor had delivered increasingly discouraging news. "This filter system is ancient," the first one had said, kicking the rusted pump with his boot. "You're looking at a full replacement." The second contractor had pointed out the deteriorating liner. "Once these start to go, it's just a matter of time before you're dealing with major leakage." The third, a grizzled pool veteran named Dave, had been the most direct. "Look, buddy, this thing is a money pit. The structure is compromised, the electrical needs updating to meet code, and that's before we talk about modern safety requirements." He handed Thomas a detailed quote that made his eyes widen. $3,000? Just for basic repairs? Dave had nodded grimly. "And that's just to get it functional. To make it fully compliant with current safety codes, you're looking at closer to $8,000. New fence, proper gate, updated electrical, modern filter system." That evening, Thomas had pulled up his bank account on his laptop. His inheritance had included some savings, but not enough to throw thousands at a pool he didn't even want. The homeowner's insurance premium increase was already stretching his monthly budget. He sketched out alternatives for the space: a vegetable garden, a fire pit with seating, maybe a small deck where he could have morning coffee. The ideas energized him in a way that the problematic pool never had. By Saturday, Thomas had made his decision. He called Sun Valley Landscaping, a company Harold had recommended, and arranged for the pool removal to begin Monday morning. The quote was reasonable: $1,200 to remove the pool, fill in the area, and prepare it for landscaping. Thomas put down a deposit immediately. On Sunday afternoon, Thomas showered after a morning of yard work and walked the short distance to Patricia's house. He believed in being direct and courteous, even in potentially uncomfortable situations. This was his property, but he wanted to handle the notification properly. Patricia's house was immaculate, a 2-story colonial with pristine white siding and black shutters. Hanging baskets of bright flowers flanked the porch steps, and the lawn looked like it had been measured with a ruler before cutting. Thomas pressed the doorbell, hearing a melodic chime echo inside. When Patricia opened the door, her initial expression was one of surprise, quickly masked with a tight smile. "Thomas, what a pleasant surprise. I was just about to call you about the pool opening next weekend. My son is bringing the grandkids on Saturday, so we'll need to get the chemicals balanced by Thursday at the latest." Thomas took a deep breath. "Actually, Patricia, that's why I'm here. I wanted to let you know personally that I decided to remove the pool. A contractor is coming tomorrow morning to begin the work." He explained his reasoning calmly: the significant repair costs, the liability concerns, his plans for the space. He had rehearsed this conversation, expecting disappointment but hoping for understanding. He even offered to help find a community pool where her grandchildren could swim. But as Patricia's expression transformed from confusion to disbelief to outrage, Thomas realized he had severely underestimated the situation. Patricia's reaction was immediate and explosive. Her face flushed crimson as she shouted that he had no right to remove a pool that the neighborhood children have enjoyed for years. When Thomas calmly explained that the pool was entirely on his property according to the deed, Patricia accused him of being selfish and cruel. She stormed away, slamming her door and declaring that he would hear about this. Thomas returned home uneasy but determined to proceed with his plans. "You can't be serious," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as Thomas finished explaining his decision. Her perfectly manicured nails gripped the doorframe so tightly her knuckles whitened. "That pool has been part of this neighborhood for decades. I understand it's disappointing," Thomas said, maintaining his composure, "but the pool requires extensive repairs that repairs." Patricia's voice rose sharply. "My husband and I have been maintaining that pool perfectly for years. There's nothing wrong with it that a little cleaning won't fix." Thomas tried again. "The contractors identified structural issues and code violations that—" "What contractors?" she interrupted. "You didn't consult me before bringing in some random people to evaluate our pool?" The possessive pronoun hung in the air between them. Thomas took a deep breath. "Patricia, I need to be clear about something. It's not our pool. The pool is entirely on my property and according to the deed. I don't care what some paperwork says." Patricia's voice had risen to a shout now, drawing the attention of a neighbor across the street who paused while retrieving his mail. "Your uncle understood the value of community. You knew that pool brought joy to children and families. But you? She jabbed a finger toward Thomas's chest. You just waltz in here after he's gone and decide to destroy something precious to this neighborhood? Who do you think you are? Thomas stepped back, maintaining his calm despite his racing heart. I'm the legal owner of the property, Patricia. I have made my decision based on safety concerns, liability issues, and personal preference for how I want to use my yard. Patricia's face contorted with rage. You selfish, heartless man. My grandchildren will be devastated. The whole neighborhood will know what you've done. I'm sorry you feel that way, Thomas said, beginning to turn away. But the contractors will be starting tomorrow morning. Oh, no, they won't, Patricia hissed, her voice trembling with anger. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Thomas Wilson. I'm on the HOA board. I have friends in the city council. My brother-in-law is a lawyer. Thomas paused. This property isn't under HOA control, Patricia. I checked thoroughly before making my decision. Something in his calm certainty seemed to push Patricia over the edge. Her face flushed an even deeper shade of red, and for a moment, Thomas worried about her blood pressure. You'll regret this, she spat. The Wilsons have always been difficult, but this is beyond the pale. You're destroying the fabric of this community. With that, she stepped back and slammed the door with such force that one of her hanging flower baskets swayed precariously. Thomas stood on her porch for a moment, his heart pounding. He'd expected disappointment, perhaps even anger, but the level of Patricia's rage was unsettling. As he walked back to his house, he noticed several neighbors had emerged onto their porches or driveways, watching with undisguised interest. Harold, from 2 doors down, gave him a subtle thumbs up. The Millers quickly ducked back inside when Thomas glanced their way. Back in his kitchen, Thomas poured himself a glass of water with shaking hands. He was doing the right thing, he knew that. But Patricia's parting words echoed in his mind. What exactly did she mean by "you'll regret this"? Despite his certainty about his legal rights, Thomas had a sinking feeling that tomorrow wouldn't go as smoothly as planned. Monday morning, the contractors arrived to begin dismantling the pool. They had barely unloaded their equipment when Patricia appeared in Thomas's backyard, smartphone in hand, recording the scene while unleashing a tirade about neighborhood rights and destroying children's happiness. When Thomas politely asked her to leave his property, she refused, planting herself firmly beside the pool. The contractors looked at Thomas uncomfortably, unsure how to proceed. Minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of the house. Patricia had called 911, claiming that Thomas was destroying community property.